All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Claire Morton, and I am the Community Assistance Manager here at MHP. If you were here with us last week, welcome back. And if this is your first time joining us, welcome to session 2 of MHP's web series, More Than Compliance, Multifamily Districts That Work in Your Community. Graciously sponsored by the Bar Foundation, this series is an important part of MHP's Technical Assistance Program for MBTA communities. Last week, Christine Medor, MHP's Senior Development Manager, and a panel of experts and community advocates explained what complete neighborhoods are and the benefits they bring to communities. Today, we'll learn about water and wastewater basics for MBTA communities. Today's speaker is Joe Pesnola. Joe is the Director of Engineering. Mr. Pesnola is a registered professional engineer in Massachusetts and New Hampshire, with over 32 years of experience in land development. His experience includes technical quality control and assurance for the engineering department, strategic planning, and business development and project management. He is an MHP designated consultant, providing local zoning boards assistance in navigating the comprehensive permit process for housing projects. He is also a member of Mass DEP's Sewer Stakeholders Advisory Board. With that, let's welcome Joe Pesnola.
Good afternoon, everyone. Hoping that we can move through this efficiently and try to give some people some information with regard to water and wastewater for multifamily projects that with specifics towards the MBTA communities ordinances. I am an engineer and I'll try to keep it not overly technical, but some of the information is technical based. So we'll work on that. I'm gonna share my screen and bring up the presentation I've got. And while I do that, I just wanted to try to get a handle on where people are from and what their positions are, whether it's town staff or government agencies or town board members. So while I'm getting started, if everyone could, or not everyone, if you want to, please jump into the chat and tell us what your position is. Keep it simple. We'll try to get a little handle on what the audience is. So I'm seeing a lot of town planners, so I'm sure that's a big part of the audience that we have here, people that are going to be tasked with putting together these zoning bylaws and ordinances to comply with the MBTA Communities Housing Act. I'm going to talk a lot about housing density and how it relates, how on-site storage disposal and water supply will impact that. So it's obviously something that town planners are going to have to grapple with in that. But I do want to, some of the earlier guidance was maybe didn't have a lot enough in it with regard to sensitivity to those challenges that many of the suburban communities will have in achieving the density goals of the guidelines with regards to communities that don't have municipal sewer and municipal water. And I think it was heard during the initial responses that came out that those communities were very concerned about that. And I think what you'll find in the guidelines that came out in August, that there has been an added appreciation for that. I'll try to run through some of them. So what I hope to to get through today is just kind of looking at the overall context with regards to the guidelines. Quick review of Title V, which is the state sanitary code, which most of you probably know is what governs what we do with wastewater on properties, development properties, residential development. We're going to talk a little bit about density and how that's defined, what impacts density. And one of the things that definitely impacts density is building type. Whether or not your bylaws will speak to building type, it's important to understand the impact that has on density. We'll talk a little bit about wastewater treatment option when we get to larger projects. We'll talk about how a large project is defined with regards to when we go from a septic system to a wastewater treatment plant. We'll talk about a little bit about water supply and what that means where there is not municipal water available. We'll go over some real world examples to finish up the presentation and hopefully leave time for questions you might all have. So the Mbt Communities Act Guidelines, the latest version was released or the final version was released on August 10th. And as you know, it requires the towns and communities to create zoning ordinances or bylaws that provide for at least one district reasonably sized, which multifamily housing is permitted as a right. It does require a minimum gross density of 15 units an acre, which is where I think a lot of the controversy was raised, especially for the smaller outlying communities. But that density is subject to any further limitations imposed by the Wetlands Act, Mass General Law, Chapter 131, Section 40, and Title V, the State Sanitary Code. So that language is right in the guidelines. It must be located within a half a mile of a commuter rail station, subway station, ferry terminal, or bus station. And there are some areas that's not applicable, but in general, that's the goal, is to connect these housing projects in the housing zoning district or overlay district to those transportation cannot include age-restricted housing. And the gross density includes land occupied by rights of ways, recreation, civic, commercial, and non-other residential. So that's a little bit cloudier with regards to how that is, but I think this was an appreciation that they didn't, we don't want to see districts that are so forced into areas in which they may be suspect as to whether or not they can be developed, and that when we get to gross density, it's not just about the land, but it's the overall area. So when they're looking for that 50 acres or whatever it be, that it can be expansive and it can include some of these areas occupied by right-of-ways and civic and commercial uses. One of the things that I definitely noted in the final version of the guidelines was the inclusion of discussion on sensitive land, because I think that's critical to a town's consideration. And the guidelines define sensitive land, meaning developable land that, due to its soils, slope, hydrology, or other physical characteristics, has significant conservation values that could be impaired, or vulnerabilities that could be exacerbated by development of housing. So it's an appreciation that there might be some land that, while it may look and act like it's developable and could be developable for certain uses. There's an appreciation that if we put multifamily on these areas, that it could be bad. So we probably want to stay away from these areas. And it's areas that might increase the damage by flooding. These areas could be wetland buffer zones that extend beyond the Title V setback areas, land subject to flooding, obviously wetland resource areas, but also priority habitat for rare and endangered species, which are areas that are mapped within the state. And if you go on Mass Mapper, which used to be Mass GIS, you can see these endangered species areas. And it also includes DEP-approved wellhead protection areas, and I'm going to talk about wellhead protection areas a little bit more in detail as we get going. And lastly, areas with prime agricultural soils that are in active agriculture. So there are mappings for prime agricultural soils, which again is in Mass Mapper, but the distinction here is they have to actually be in active agricultural use. So the guidelines go on further to speak to determining a reasonable size. Here's that 50 acres. In rapid transit communities, commuter rail communities, and adjacent communities. And the guidelines do break down all of the 171 communities into 4 categories: rapid transit communities, community rail communities, adjacent communities, and adjacent small towns. So every community should understand what category they're in, and the guidelines do change what the requirements are based on those categories. So in those first 3 categories, there's the 50 acres, but in adjacent small towns, there's no minimum. As long as and this goes on to define what adjacent small towns are, that has within its boundaries less than 100 acres of area, either has a population density of less than 500 persons per square mile, or a population of 7,000 year-round residents. The total number of possible units in the MBTA communities are further defined. So at the beginning, when the first guidelines came out, everyone just took the 50 acres and the 15 units, and they said, oh my gosh, we're going to get 750 units. We did the math. It's a little bit more refined here, and it's a little bit more specific to each community. And the breakdowns is, as you see, in rapid transit communities, it's 25% of the total. Commuter rail communities, 15. Adjacent communities, 10. And adjacent small, 5% of the total housing. So the guidelines do get more into the water and wastewater infrastructure for these multifamily zones. To give some guidelines to the communities, and I think this had a lot more to do with some of the outlying communities where wastewater and water are challenging, either because they have no municipal systems, or the existing municipal systems are at their capacities. Many communities in Massachusetts these days that have public wells or public wastewater treatment plants are reaching their lifespans, reaching their capacities, and they're grappling with how to just maintain these systems, let alone expand and increase either the withdrawal on the well side or increase the capacity to take wastewater into those systems. So I think there's definitely sensitivity to that, appreciation. But MBTA communities are encouraged to consider the availability of water and wastewater when selecting the location for multifamily zoning districts. So that's obviously on the forefront of everyone's mind, is not only where, if there is capacity, where is the capacity and where is the infrastructure to deliver the water or collect the sewer. But also I think there's an appreciation there for the towns to consider with regards to either the sensitive lands that we just talked about, or existing soils in the area, or lack of soils or problematic soils. I think the towns are free to consider all of those factors when they're citing these things, and they should for good planning purposes. The Act does not require a town to install new water or wastewater infrastructure or to add capacity to the existing infrastructure. So certainly, while it's a consideration for the siting of the districts, it's not, the burden is not going to fall on the communities to do that. But I think there needs to be there again needs to be an appreciation, and we all want to abide by the overall goal of the MBT Communities Act, which is to produce housing. So it's just an exercise in compliance to write a bylaw, but I think we want to do it smartly and try to get to the end in which we can hopefully get the private side to help in this production. Guidelines recognize the use of private water and wastewater facilities, and we're going to get, that's really what we're going to get kind of deeper into. And the guidelines envision private developers assisting communities in expanding or upgrading existing infrastructure that has limited capacity. And I think that's a difficult one, because many times the costs of upgrading a well system or a wastewater treatment system is just unbelievable. It's just huge numbers. And while the private developer that's coming into town to develop a community can help with that, they certainly can't put the entire bill. It has to be commensurate with their impacts and their use. And we grapple with this. I'm doing several projects for Mass Housing Partnership, where I'm consultant to the board, and in communities that are grappling with their municipal infrastructure, their wastewater treatment plants, and their well systems being at capacity, and looking to the developers to help. The developers are willing to pay their fair share, but they obviously cannot take on the entire burden. And then you're stuck with a situation in which, if the upgrades are necessary, then the fair share contribution by the developer doesn't get them to where they can upgrade the system to allow them to tie in. So there's kind of a quandary there. So the developers may at that point have to look inwardly and look at a private on-site wastewater or private well on-site to meet their needs. And that has to be rolled into the project financial feasibility. The guidelines talk about, while zoning must allow gross average density of at least 15 units per acre, there may be other legal physical limitations, including the lack of infrastructure capacity, that will result in actual housing production at a lower density than zoning allows. And that's an important part there, that there's a difference between the theoretical production of units in which it's either a percentage of the total housing stock, or whatever it is that the bylaw needs to account for. But then when we get to actual housing production, there's an appreciation that the densities can be and may be lower. The guidelines assume that developers will design projects that work within the existing. And I think we're finding that on Chapter 40B projects. Obviously, there's reality, and everyone needs to stay within those bounds of reality. And developers aren't going to ask or demand or compel municipalities spending money they just don't have. So let's talk a little bit about a density, net density versus gross density. Density is a number of residential units per acre in this context that we're talking about. So we need to, in defining what portions of attractive land are used in a density, that can dramatically impact the calculation when we talk about net density as compared to gross density. So gross density would just be how big is the tract and how many units. And I think the 15 units an acre would be considered a gross density. And then net density would be what I talked about just in the previous slide, in the net density, in the actual housing production that's capable of in a certain tract of land based on the physical or regulatory constraints that occur. And I've been dealing with multifamily housing for a very long time. A great portion of my career has been in the design and permitting of multifamily housing, but also in providing consultation to communities in the review of these projects. And we can tend to get stuck on density for the discussions of density for the pure discussion of density, and just throwing numbers around. What is the density? What is the units per acre? Oh my gosh, that's just too high. And I always try to compel everyone to let density fall out of responsible design and sensitivity to the constraints, and whether those are physical constraints or they're regulatory constraints, the density will fall out. Now, a lot has to do with, and we'll go over this in a moment, the building type that we're talking about. But once the building type is kind of decided upon, and whether that be single-family homes or townhouses or apartments, 3-story walk-ups, or we get into mid-rise where we're 4 or 5 stories of residential over 2 levels of parking, that all changes. But once we agree that this type of development, this type of building is appropriate for this area, the density will fall out of those constraints and responsible design when that's, and allow that to kind of move forward. Density per usable acre will subtract areas of the tract that cannot be developed, such as wetlands, steep topography in areas encumbered by easements or other, again, physical or regulatory or legal constraints. So let's jump into the Massachusetts Sanitary Code, what's known as Title V. The regulations are 310 CMR 15.0. You want to go there and dive into the full regulations. But Title V requires the proper siting, construction, and maintenance of all on-site wastewater disposal. Communities can, and many have, imposed stricter local septic regulations, which build upon Title V or go above some of the requirements of Title V. And some of the examples of what communities do in their local septic regulations would be to increase the design flow for a residential project on a per bedroom basis. And I go from 110 gallons per bedroom per day, which is what Title V requires. And they may go to 165. The 165, by the way, happens to be 150% of 110. And the 150% comes from a requirement of Title V that if garbage grinders are allowed, then the flow must be increased by 150%. I think the original genesis in communities to go to the 165 was, we're not going to police whether or not somebody has a garbage grinder under their kitchen sink, and we're just going to make everybody use 165 so we don't have to police that. I would argue that garbage grinders are always bad for a septic system and should never be allowed. So it's better to educate the general public. They don't want a failed septic system in there. The last thing anyone wants is that, and that they shouldn't put a garbage grinder on their kitchen sink. And just to go one step further and tell you why garbage grinders are bad is because the basic components of a septic system are a septic tank and a leach field. And that's that simple. In the septic tank, we separate solids from liquids. And we take the liquids and put them into the leach field. We do not want solids going to the leach field, because the leach field is made up of perforated pipe, and it's just a 4-inch PVC pipe with little tiny holes in it. And the solids will block the holes. And if the holes are blocked, then it's not getting where it needs to go, and it backs up. And you don't want it backing up into your washing machine in your basement. So what happens in a garbage grinder is it semi liquefies solids, but not completely, passes them into your septic tank, and they think that they're liquid, but they're really not. And they get out into your leach field and they muck things up. So not a good idea. I digress. So the local regulations can also include increased setbacks to property lines, increased setbacks to wells, wetlands, a whole host of things. So there needs to be an appreciation in writing bylaws of, what the local boards of health believe that those additional requirements are, and then what those additional requirements will impose upon the potential densities that can be achieved. And I can tell you that the one underlying theme that a local septic regulation does is it requires more space. It just does. It never mattered that the local septic regulations make the development of a site more efficient. Makes the need for more land to realize disposal of wastewater in these developments. So I had mentioned that a Title V requires 110 gallons per day per bedroom. So that factor, the more bedrooms, the larger your system is. The other thing that impacts the size of your systems, the size of your leach field, is the condition of the soils themselves. So we do what's known as a percolation test, where we dig a hole in the earth, 12 inches round, 18 inches deep. We pour water into it, and we time the water leaving the hole. And with that rate, Title V dictates how much wastewater we can put per square foot of leach field. The slower the permeability, the bigger the leach field. So if you know you have an area in town that has poor soils, slowly percolating soils, they're going to have a bigger demand for area for wastewater. Now, Title V tops out at 10,000 gallons per day for any development. So that equates, if we take 10,000 gallons and we divide it by 110 gallons per day per bedroom, that equates to about 90 bedrooms. So the largest size septic system for a residential project in Massachusetts is 90 bedrooms. So once we get above 90 bedrooms, we're into what's known as a wastewater treatment, a private wastewater treatment. And that's a whole different world, if you will, and cost. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. Within Title V, there are no density. There's only one place that has a density restriction, and that has to do with what Title V defines as a nitrogen sensitive. And in those nitrogen sensitive areas, Title V limits the amount of wastewater put into the ground to 440 gallons per day per acre. So what is that? 440 divided by 110 is 4 bedrooms. So we can have a 4-bedroom single-family house on an acre of land within these nitrogen sensitive areas. So what are these nitrogen sensitive areas? They're wellhead protection area, which was mentioned in the guidelines definition of sensitive areas. And they're nitrogen sensitive embayments on the coasts that have to do with coastal areas. And essentially, these areas are just not suitable for higher density housing. That's it. So on the right-hand side, I've got a map of Boxborough from MassMapper, and the little purple circles are what's known as Zone 2 wellhead protection areas. They are wellhead. There is a Zone 1, a Zone 2, and there's another type of wellhead protection area called an interim wellhead protection area. And those are defined by regulation. They're mapped, obviously, so they're easy to find with the MassMapper tool. And within those areas, you're restricted to this 440 gallons per day per acre. You can, within Title V, add some nitrogen treatment within a conventional septic system and increase that 440 to 550, but that just gets you another bedroom in an acre. It's not going to get you where you need to be to achieve the densities that are necessary for multifamily housing. Again, these areas are not suitable for higher density housing. They need to be considered for when you're laying out your district. So let's talk a little bit about building height and resulting density. I've made this table and it's based on my experience. It's not based on any detailed calculation or statistics or anything. It's my general rules of thumb on what I tell people is possible. If we look at the net density. So we're talking net density here. We've gotten rid of all of our wetlands and floodplains and other regulatory constraints. And we're looking at, okay, I have an acre of land that I can develop. It doesn't have steep topography. This is an area that I can develop. What can I put on this acre, 2 acres, or 5 acres? When we're talking single family homes, and what I've broken down here is density with septic and density on sewer. And what I'm trying to put across to you is that with regards to theoretical possibility, there's not a huge difference between the two. Those communities that have to rely on single family home, 6 units an acre with septic is possible. And as I talked about soil conditions, certainly soil conditions will impact that. But 6 units an acre is possible. You could go to 10 units an acre with this. So what I'm saying there is, 4,000 square feet per home. This is in no way talking about conventional current zoning where the mindset has all been for a very long time that we need an acre, or we need a half acre, or we need 2 acres. This is physical potential. What can I fit if I have a house and a septic? Duplex, we up that density to 8 and 12. Townhouse is maybe 4 units together, could be 8 units together. We can get the density with septic up to 12. We can get the density on sewer up to 18. These also consider when we start to get into the higher densities, the higher density building types. This also considers parking and other necessary infrastructure within these areas. We get to garden style, 3 stories with surface parking. So not parking under your building, but parking out in a parking lot. 20 units an acre on septic, 28 units an acre if we were on sewer. Mid-rise with structured parking, we're going to get into densities that are immediately going to exceed the 10,000 gallons. So septic's not really there. But I've seen projects that are approaching 100 units per usable acre. Those projects contextually probably don't happen, outside the 495 belt and out into the more rural communities. But when we get inside 495 and definitely inside 128, you're seeing that they're happening. They're 5 stories of residential on top of 2 4-unit parking decks, and they're really getting those densities. So I think what to pull from this with regards to the subject at hand in the MBTA communities is that 15 units an acre. It's going to be difficult to achieve those densities if your bylaw focuses on the development of single-family homes and duplex. Because those densities, those types of housing take up more land. They just do with their superficial requirements. And so there's an efficiency when we start to put units together and to begin to build vertically. So let's touch a little bit upon that greater than 10,000 gallons per day and the private wastewater treatment option. So again, we get to a project that has 90 bedrooms and we want to do more. We want to do 100 bedrooms. We move from a septic system, which is a fairly simple system that has a septic tank and a leach field. And we immediately move into a private wastewater treatment facility that needs what's known as a groundwater discharge permit from Mass DEP. It also takes the jurisdiction of that wastewater system from the local Board of Health and puts it in DEP's hands. As far as, and there's nothing in between. Septic system at 90 bedrooms. It's a wastewater treatment system at 100 bedrooms. These systems can be cost prohibitive. They're a minimum of $2 million in the initial construction and startup. They are packaged. Most of them are packaged treatment plants. So you buy from a company your treatment plant, the guts of your plant. You build a little 2,000 square foot building and you put the treatment stuff in there, and then you need to collect and pump all your waste into that treatment plant, treat it to very prescribed levels, and then you put it out into an effluent field, which isn't dissimilar from a leach field in a septic system, but you're putting essentially clean water out into that. It comes with annual operation monitoring, testing, and reporting requirements that are incredibly rigid. And they cost upwards of $100,000 a year to do. You need to have a licensed treatment plant operator, licensed by the state, at the facility 5 days a week. Now, that's not 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, but it's 5 days a week. The EP will demand that operator visit that site on an ongoing business. The effluent fields can and are smaller because you're putting clean water into the ground, so the sizing requirements are smaller. So there is some efficiency there, but it doesn't compensate for the costs. So what we find is the size project that can absorb those costs isn't a 100-bedroom project. It's 300 or 400 bedrooms, so that the economy of scale and the revenue that's generated from those projects can absorb those costs. The permitting for this again goes through DEP, through the groundwater discharge permit process, and it can take upwards of a year. So it's quite a daunting task to overcome. So what that results in, and what I've found and talked at length to anyone who will listen, is it creates a gap in project size. So we have the 90 bedrooms in a septic system, and then we need to go to the 300 or 400 bedroom system to be able to absorb the costs of a wastewater treatment plant. And the size projects in between, your 100 bedrooms, your 200 bedrooms, your 60 unit project, just can't get built in areas that don't have municipal sewer. So that's impactful to a lot of different types of developments, and one of the hardest hit is the nonprofits that are trying to develop projects, and their funding sources and their pro formas want a 50, 60, 65, 70 unit project that they just can't build because they're very limited in where they can build. And with the industry, the housing production industry, both private, nonprofit, and public, have been trying to compel the Commonwealth to consider something in between a septic system and a wastewater treatment. Something that might have more regulatory oversight, might have more monitoring, reporting, but not, and some additional treatment, but not to the level that is required for the wastewater treatment. That would come with the price tags not only through the startups, but the annual costs. And their Mass DEP is, they can appreciate the idea. I just think we need to, as communities and advocates for housing, need to push a little bit harder, so that there is not that gap in project size, and we could build more. And it will give the communities more flexibility in how you plan for compliance with the MBTA communities. So let's talk a little bit about drinking water regulations. And there, while many communities do not have municipal wastewater facilities, a lot of communities do have municipal water. Very, I haven't dove into how many of the 171 communities have no municipal water, but they're out there, and there may be others that have limited municipal water, and projects are going to have to rely on private wells. At these densities, these private wells for these projects will be considered public water systems. And the state defines public water systems as when you have a provision for public using water through pipes or other construction conveyance. If that system has more than 15 service connections, or regularly serves an average of at least 25 individuals for at least 60 days in the year, it is a public water supply. The rigors between an individual single-family home or a common well serving less than 25 individuals and a public water supply are not dissimilar to the difference between a septic system and a wastewater treatment plant. They come with regulatory permitting requirements, monitoring, testing, treatment, all of the rigors that a municipality would have to go through, or that has to go through if they have a municipal water system, will now fall upon a private development. So there needs to be an understanding and a sensitivity to those costs, and to the implications on density of. So when you have a public water supply, you have a zone 1, zone 2, or an interim wellhead protection area. Those sensitive areas that I talked about earlier on a couple different slides, that limitation to 440 gallons per day per acre all of a sudden come into play, and you're actually imposing that upon yourself. So now the land requirements get impacted. While I said the zone 2 doesn't have to, in areas where you have a zone 2, it's not appropriate for multifamily housing. Here you would have to find a way to understand where your zone 1 is, understand where your zone 2 is, and then understand where your development is going to be that can, and the size of the area of the land that's associated with it that can meet those imposed constraints. So it becomes much more difficult when we have a public water supply that's related to developing multifamily housing. And I have to tell you that we don't see it a lot. We don't see projects, large projects, that are proposing their own public water supply. They do occur. I just assisted the town of Bolton in reviewing a new project right on Main Street that will have its water supply and a wastewater treatment plant. That was, the developer found a way to make it work. So the zone 1 is defined. It's a mathematical equation based on how much water they're going to draw out of the well. But nothing can happen in the zone 1 that's not associated with the well. There can't be parking lots, buildings, there can't be anything that's not associated with the well. The zone 2 is again defined by either a mathematical equation or an analysis of the groundwater movement itself, hydrogeological analysis to define what that area that would contribute to the well is. So either way, it comes with those restrictions I talked about earlier. So it's very daunting, and again, we as communities, you need to understand if you're going to target an area that would rely upon developments putting in public water supplies, there's definitely major impacts. So next going to move into, just check the chat to see if there's questions.
Joe, this
Yeah.
is Katie. So there is a question that's been asked by 2 people, and that is one that we encounter all the time, and that's largely about who carries the cost for these things. So Leanne in Middleborough and Allison and Drake had asked, look, the town's wastewater treatment plant is a capacity. Can the bylaw amendment specifically require developers to have a private treatment plant? Another question is, how do we calculate the developer's reasonable share of an expansion? And so I think the thought is, and the concern on the town's front is that they're going to get stuck with the tab somehow.
Yeah.
So what would be your response to this?
Well, the guidelines are clear that it's not the responsibility of the town to incur the costs of either providing the infrastructure or upgrading the infrastructure to support development. But I think there needs to be a sensitivity to the individual case in the community of what's going on. Where are you with your municipal wastewater and municipal wells? Many times, in the case of wastewater, a municipality with a wastewater treatment system has an upset limit that they can discharge, whether it's into a local stream, which is most of them, most of the older systems, or an effluent field, or a combination of the two. They have an upset limit, and they need to report to DEP on a regular basis what they're discharging. And if they routinely exceed 80% of that limitation, they need to put together a comprehensive wastewater management plan, a new plan. What is their long-term project, or long-term, how are they're going to address the issue of that? And that might include the beginnings of plans to upgrade or expand those systems. It may be that they're complacent and that they need to live with those constraints, and then the development community has to take care of business on their own side. If there is capacity in between 80 and 100, that becomes difficult for the communities, because if they have to then give that capacity to this new overlay district, then they may not be able to service other areas. But that's where the comprehensive wastewater management plan that they put together should speak to. It should speak to the needs of the community, and in this case, the need to comply with the Mbt Communities Act, and can that compliance take some of that capacity. It could be, where are there environmentally sensitive areas where they know they're having septic systems fail, and they need to expand they need to go service those residents, because the residents can't put a replacement system in because there's some environmental constraints, and replacement septic systems are just not an option. That needs to be kind of brought into the mix. So the communities should either get to the point where they understand all of that allocation and can roll that into their plan. Or if they are just at the upset limit, let it be known, let it be dictated, let it drive where those districts, where the multifamily housing districts are. And I don't know that it necessarily needs to specifically state that you need to take care of your own wastewater, but I think it needs to just be part of the community process in which that's clear that we don't have any more capacity. In the case of Chelmsford, Mass, they're at capacity. So they've now put a moratorium and said, we don't have any more, period. There's other communities that I'm working with that have active Chapter 40B projects before them that are in that 80 to 100%, and they're really struggling with whether or not they should allow this project to connect to the sewer and take up a good chunk of their remaining capacity. And it's difficult. It's not cut and dry to say yes you can or no you can't. So it definitely is a situation by situation thing that the communities have to understand and do that. With regards to if you've defined upgrades and now you want to have a development pay its fair share, it's kind of easy. What is the upgrade going to realize in added capacity? We're going to add 100,000 gallons. This project wants 20,000. Well, you could tell the developer you have to pay 20% of this cost if you want the benefit of being able to send your wastewater to us. And I think that the development community understands that. They just don't. The difficulty comes when there isn't the money to pay for the 100,000 gallons, even if you got your 20% from developer A. Now developer A is sitting on the sidelines wanting to connect, but they can't because the whole project isn't done. So there needs to be a sensitivity and appreciation.
Yeah. But I think, what I'm hearing from the state is, the bottom line is a developer, the presence of a density capacity in zoning does not compel a municipality to pay for anything at all. Nor on the other end, and a developer wanting to develop something, even with the zoning in place, they could get the zoning permit. They certainly can't get a building permit without sufficient water or sewer capacity. So it's a kind of an is what it is type of scenario for the community. But, I think it is confusing because it sounds like if the state is saying you have to put this zoning in, that the communities are going to somehow be left paying for it.
No, I think it's now clear in the guidelines that that's not the case, and the guidelines talk about the density, the achievable density versus actual density. I think the actual density that's realized in the production of housing will shake itself out with those constraints in mind. But what I'm hoping is that communities don't force themselves where theoretically they could meet the achievement, but they knowingly put the district in a place that the actual density realized just can't happen. So in that they consider all of where they are in, as you said, is what it is. Where are we with our water withdrawal permit and our wastewater discharge? And how can we proactively look at areas of good soils where it might be cost effective for that development to handle their on-site, their wastewater needs on-site. Maybe there can be, Littleton's looking at doing a quasi-public-private wastewater system that will just service a small area, and I'm hopeful that the development that's realized there will be part of their MBTA communities zoning ordinance. I think Maren will try hard to do that, but there's creative ways to do that. So maybe the burden's not on a single developer, but it's on a combination of multiple developers with some community input, where it's complicated, and it really can't be one size fits all. It's really got to be honed, and it's going to be very interesting to see what the communities do, you know, on an individual basis. I think we're going to see vastly different approaches to all of this. So I wanted to go through some real world density examples that have implications of the different constraints that we've talked about so far. This one's Emerson Village in Pepperell. It was a Chapter 40B project. It is actually a single family homes on fee lots. The lots are as small as 7,000 square feet. They have individual on-site septic systems for each of the lots. If you can believe it, within the 7,000 square feet. It is a former sand gravel pit, so the soils were very conducive to keeping the septic systems as small as possible. Also, it has no real topographic constraints. And it did include a very large part of the overall lot was a wetland area. And it had a public well that was being permitted by the community. Pepperell was trying to permit a new water supply, new well, and the developer worked with the town. The town actually took ownership of the excess land in the back for the well, and that totally encompassed their zone 1. There was a zone 2 that was developed within the property itself, so all of these lots were subject to the 440 gallons per day per acre. Oh gosh, you just said it was 7,000 square feet per lot. How did we do that? Well, there's something in Title V called nitrogen aggregation, and it sounds more complicated than it is, but essentially what it is we can take the total acreage that we control within that aquifer, within that area, and we can aggregate the total land area towards meeting the 440. And we actually need a permit from DEP, which at this time it was from DEP. Now that permit, a nitrogen aggregation permit, has been transferred to the boards of health, in which the permit is issued to allow these small lots, as long as in aggregate we meet the 440. And there was enough land in the back with the wetlands and the well area to do that. And you can use wetlands towards that aggregation to meet it, because it's really about limiting how much nitrogen we put in the ground on a per acre basis. So obviously, if we can't put septic into a wetland, but the wetland area is still there, and it's still preserved, and it's still not being used by someone else to meet that 440. And that's the idea of the aggregation permit, is it takes that whole area that this is 56 homes, and they're 3 bedrooms. So you can do the math, how much land do we need? And the permit encompasses all of that land and permanently protects it. So no one else can use it for aggregation. No one else can use it to meet the 440. And that is an ability to, in this case, achieve these densities with on-site septic and a public water system. This one actually the developer wanted to avoid a homeowners association, so they asked the town to take over the roads. So these are all public roads, and it's a great project because not only was 25% affordable, the market rates were very small, austere houses that were also very affordable. Actually, was a problem during the 08-09 recession because the value of the market rate units started to move very close to the pricing on the affordable units. And we had a hard time getting rid of finding buyers for the affordable units because people were coming to the conclusion that, well, why should I buy an affordable unit? I know I qualify, but I also qualify to buy a market rate unit. And they were buying the market rate units. So they didn't live with the perpetual restrictions on affordable units. So great example of a project that can happen. I will admit this project will probably not meet the 15 units an acre if we reverse engineered a zoning overlay into it, but it is a good example of working with the constraints. Coolidge at Sudbury is a age-restricted project that was done by Mbt Housing. It's 120 units that was done in 2 phases. Each of the phases has a on-site septic system, but it does have town water. So, wait a minute, you said we can't do more than 90 bedrooms on a septic system. How did they do this? Well, what they did is they got creative with the ownership of the 2 phases, and the 2 phases are owned by separate entities. They're controlled by separate entities. They have separate funding mechanisms, individual responsibilities for the operation and maintenance of the septic systems. So in DEP's mind, they were as if they were separate lots under separate ownerships, and they therefore did not have to be joined to evaluate the maximum 10,000 gallons per day on a septic system. But they are looking at a 3rd phase for this site, and that would require that they go to a wastewater treatment option because they wouldn't be able to do that again. Granite Woods is in Westford. It's 72 units. And this actually is an example that when I said it was difficult to justify an on-site wastewater treatment facility for projects that were too small, this is an example when it actually worked. At only 72 units, they were able to absorb the cost of the wastewater treatment facility. And I think part of this was the actual value of each of the homes or townhouses that was so high for the market rates that there was a lot more money available to fund that. But generally speaking, when we're looking at these projects that are either rental projects or more austere condominium projects, that rule does apply. That we do have that gap in where we need 300 or 400 bedrooms to justify and financially absorb the costs of the wastewater treatment. That is my presentation, and I am a little early, so I'm happy to take any other questions that might be there. And I don't know if you want to go live with the questions or
I think we can go live. We have a bit, 20 minutes. We don't need to use it all, but there was a lot of technical information. So maybe if people, I can't really see everyone here, but if people want to raise their hand or throw something in the chat, we could. If you want to put it in the chat, we could repeat it or what have you. The other concern I'm getting that we hear about is can the developer compel the town to approve something that's actually bad for the water supply, bad for the environment? Oh, here we have a live question from Annette Lewis. Go ahead.
Thank you. My question is, you were talking about gross and net when you were talking about number of units and what you could put into a zone. And you were explaining that there's a difference, but we still have, for example, for our community, 750 units. So somehow you've got to squeeze it in somewhere, don't you?
Yeah, theoretically, you need to look at that. That 50 acres and that 15 units an acre. But I don't think anyone's going to be doing the calculation of 750 because the way that the implementation of the regulations are is that as long as it's theoretically possible, there's never going to be a reassessment of the actual realized. There's so many other factors that will come into play in what is actually realized. That there won't be any action against the community if 750 units don't get created.
But in what you were talking about, and you were talking about Title V and wetlands and all of that, I mean, we've just done a preliminary look and we're already having issues trying to even get the 50 acres that's real.
Mm-hmm. And you've looked at what category community you're in, you
Yes.
are? Yeah.
Yes, we're adjacent.
It's, I think, I don't know because I'm not part of the team in the state that's going to be reviewing these ordinances and bylaws. But I'm certainly would hope that there's some kind of a relief mechanism where you've done your due diligence and reviewed the physical constraints and you go back to the state and say, okay, we can't find 50 acres. But the 50 acres, again, can include right-of-ways and other zone property, commercially developed properties and so forth. So I don't think it's just looking at the available parcels and saying, I don't have a parcel that's 50 acres that I can do that to. I think you can cast the overlay wider and include those rights of ways and those other zoned properties.
Annette, why don't follow up with me directly and I can connect you with the folks at DHCD that can give you a specific answer, okay?
Okay, who is me?
I'm Katie Lacey. I'll put my email in the chat.
Thank you.
I had a question come in directly to me that I'd like to pose, Joe. It was when you noted that nitrogen sensitive areas are not appropriate for higher density. Is this irrespective of whether or not a public sewer system was to be extended or installed? In other words, if the community chose to invest in the construction or expansion of a public sewer system into such sensitive areas, is it still true that they're not appropriate for greater density? Does that make sense?
You still have the restriction of the 440 gallons per day per acre. If the reason for the nitrogen sensitive classification is bestowed, well still exists and casts into the area that you're trying to consider for development, you're still going to be, oh, okay, you're not going to be restricted because you're not, I guess, because you're not going to be putting any wastewater into the ground. So no, it wouldn't, because it's only applicable if you are using conventional septic systems. So yes, started to answer one way and I reversed. So yes, you'd still be developing in that area, but connecting to the municipal sewer means you're not putting wastewater in. The other clarification I'll make is that if you put a wastewater, if a developer puts a wastewater treatment facility on a project, they're not subject to the 440 gallons per acre because they're treating the effluent first before they discharge. It's only applicable to those projects that are utilizing septic systems in accordance with federal.
There's a question, does the town have to determine soil types in the district before we determine our zone, our MBTA district? And again, I really think you should follow up with DHCD for specific answers to this, but my understanding is no, there is land that's not considered developable in the calculation that's going to be excluded. That is the identified nitrogen sensitive areas. But other than that, no. And so those are already identified by DEP. And then there's another question. Can you speak a little to the impact of a district made up of many smaller lots versus a single or larger lot, thinking in terms of setback calculations? And I think that may actually be more of a DHCD question because it's about lot layout and design. But love to hear a wastewater perspective on that one.
It's going to be more challenging, obviously, because if you're targeting smaller lot development, then the use of those setbacks are going to start to come into play and start to impact the realized density.
I don't know, Emma and Claire, do you see any other questions or anyone with their hand up?
No, I haven't gotten any questions
I
on
have-
my end.
Yeah, I have two that came into me.
Go ahead.
So Joe, I don't know if you'll be able to speak to this, but someone noted it looks like Massachusetts has higher zoning restrictions. What states might help us see other options? Are you familiar with this?
Don't really know if I understand the question as far as there is no state imposed zoning restrictions, that would come into play here. They're community based. And we're obviously talking about new zoning that doesn't. New Hampshire has a similar requirement to the 440 gallons per day per acre that is irrespective of nitrogen sensitivity, and it's 2,000 gallons per acre. So we've talked to DEP about potentially abandoning the 440 and looking at a septic related density requirement or guideline for all development that would be sensitive to the need for land for septic, which is obvious, but also kind of give some guidelines to it as having them loosen some of the other constraints that impact multifamily.
Great, thanks. And the last one here is, does a district's proximity to a river impact its ability to utilize treatment plants?
Yes. The first step in a design of a wastewater treatment plant is to do a hydrogeological analysis of the area that you want to put the effluent into the discharge. That hydrogeological analysis is going to look at everything from the movement of groundwater, the proximity to sensitive receptors, and those can be wells or rivers or anything like that. And they're going to their DEP is going to review that and essentially say that site is appropriate for this much gallonage on a daily basis, such that because we have done a review of the analysis and those sensitive receptors are protected. So it's going to consider the river. And it really could be that it's not a set distance from the river. because it's going to be totally dependent on what's happening below the ground with the groundwater and how that river interacts with it. But in the end, it is a detailed analysis, a very detailed analysis that attempts to ensure that those sensitive receptors are not impacted by wastewater treatment.
Thanks, Joe.
Thank you, Joe. I think at this point, we're gonna go ahead and wrap it up. So I will go ahead and share my screen. As you all know, this is session 2. Honestly, who would have thought it'd be so interesting to talk about wastewater and sewerage? So thank you, Joe, for this very informative.
Sound like my wife, Claire.
It was very informative, and I think we can all walk away with some good information. As we put in the chat, this will be available online. We also, if you go ahead and check the chat, we'll drop some links to some very helpful resources that you all can use if you need. But thank you everyone for your time today. Again, join us next week, same place, same time for session 3, which will be Complete Streets and Neighborhoods for MBTA Communities, presented by representatives over at the Metropolitan Area Planning Council. We will give you back about 7 minutes of your day. Enjoy and be safe. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.